Did you know that historians still debate whether the earliest Slavic tribes, those ancient peoples whose echoes linger in Russia's vast forests, migrated from beyond the Carpathian Mountains, or had long farmed along its great rivers? It's a captivating mystery, isn't it? The very soil holds secrets of an empire's origins. Picture the mists of time parting to reveal scattered settlements, small, independent communities with loose tribal bonds, sharing dialects and honoring nature gods like Perun, the thunder deity, or Veles, guardian of the underworld and cattle. These were the Proto-Russians, subsisting on farming, hunting in wild woodlands, and fending off steppe nomads. Russia was an alien concept then, like a smartphone in medieval hands. Yet, from these humble beginnings, the threads of a superpower were woven. The immense, unforgiving land shaped its people, building resilience and a bond with nature's cycles. Dense forests provided shelter, while rivers like the Dnieper, Volga, and Neva became lifelines for trade and conquest. Now envision seafaring warriors from the north. The Varangians, Viking traders with sleek longships slicing through Baltic waters. They sought not outright conquest, but lucrative routes from Scandinavia to Byzantium's markets. This cultural collision was electric, a historical remix of Slavs and Norsemen. Known as Rus to the locals, these Vikings integrated, offering protection for tribute and introducing new governance. Think of them as ancient consultants, optimizing tribal structures for a price. Legend says weary Slavic tribes invited Varangian chief Rurik to rule, lamenting, "Our land is great and abundant, but there is no order." Whether true or a later fabrication to justify foreign rule, Rurik's arrival was pivotal. His successors, like Oleg, consolidated power, shifting south from Novgorod to Kiev. Varangians blended with Slavs through marriage and culture, shedding Viking ways for Russian ones, like trading horned helmets for fur caps. The Varangians to the Greeks' route brought wealth, ideas, and beliefs, forging an emerging state amid violence and exchange. This fusion birthed Kievan Rus, the cradle of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, a loosely unified kingdom. In 882 CE, Oleg seized Kiev, declaring it the mother of Rus's cities, a bold grab of prime river real estate. Early princes, blending Norse and Slavic blood, collected tribute via poliudi, armed tax rounds, blending force and finance. Vladimir the Great's era brought a watershed. Initially a pagan idol worshipper, he explored religions, sending envoys abroad. Captivated by Orthodox Christianity's splendor in Constantinople's Hagia Sophia, he adopted it in 988 CE, tying Kievan Rus to Byzantium. This geopolitical masterstroke unified diverse peoples, boosted literacy with the Cyrillic alphabet, and sparked a cultural boom, churches rising, monasteries fostering art, and laws evolving under Byzantine influence. Kievan Rus peaked under Yaroslav the Wise in the 11th century, a diplomat, builder, and legislator whose marriages allied with European royals. His Ruskaya Pravda Code standardized justice. Kiev thrived as a bustling hub, rivaling Constantinople, with spice scents mingling amid multilingual markets. But cracks emerged. The Rhoda succession system fueled princely rivalries like deadly musical chairs. Trade routes declined, regional autonomy grew, and nomads like Pechenegs strained defenses. By the 13th century, Kievan Rus fragmented into warring principalities, its golden age fading as a steppe storm gathered. That storm was the Mongols, unified under Genghis Khan, a ruthless horde descending like locusts. Their 1223 preview at the Kalka River crushed a disunited Rus's force, a warning ignored amid petty rivalries. In the 1230s, Batu Khan's full invasion razed cities like Ryazan, Moscow, and Kiev in 1240, leaving devastation. The Mongol yoke imposed indirect rule via the Golden Horde, demanding tribute and yarliks for princes. This humiliating subjugation fragmented Rus, drained economies, and shifted populations northward. Yet, it forged resilience. Rus's princes learned centralized rule, adopting Mongol tactics while preserving orthodoxy as cultural anchor. Paradoxically, this crucible birthed a distinct Russian identity, paving the way for Muscovy's rise. From Kievan ashes, Muscovy emerged in the forested north, a strategic confluence of rivers, initially unassuming, but destined for dominance. Princes like Daniel Alexandrovich practiced calculated submission to the Mongols, gaining favor and resources while rivals faltered. Geography shielded it, forests as barriers, central trade hubs. Moscow expanded via purchases, marriages, and conquests, like a puzzle assembled piece by piece. Alliance with the Orthodox Church was key. The Metropolitan's relocation to Moscow in the 14th century bestowed spiritual legitimacy, positioning it as Kiev's heir and the Third Rome. Ivan I's moneybags amassed wealth, lending to princes and buying land. Defiance flickered, like Dmitry Donskoy's 1380 Kulikovo victory, a symbolic blow to Mongol invincibility, boosting Moscow's prestige. Ivan III, the Great, 1462 to 1505, elevated Muscovy to preeminence, annexing rivals like Novgorod in 1478, dismantling its independence. He overthrew the yoke in 1480's bloodless Ugra standoff, a psychological triumph. Post-Constantinople's fall, Moscow claimed Third Rome status, adopting the double-headed eagle. Italian architects transformed the Kremlin into a stone fortress. Ivan centralized administration with the 1497 Sudebnik Code and service nobility, laying autocracy's foundations. His grandson, Ivan IV, the Terrible, 1547 to 1584, became Russia's first Tsar, blending reforms with terror. Early, he modernized Vyazemsky Sobor, a new Sudebnik and Streltsy army, but paranoia spawned the Oprichnina, a state within a state, enforced by black-clad terror squads crushing boyars. The 1570 Novgorod massacre exemplified brutality, devastating the economy. Yet, he conquered Kazan and Astrakhan, expanding south and east into Siberia. The Livonian War drained resources, and his son's death left a weak heir, foreshadowing chaos. Ivan's death plunged Russia into the time of troubles, 1598 to 1613, a vortex of famine, impostors, and invasion. The Rurikid dynasty ended with Fyodor I's childless death. Boris Godunov's reign faltered amid 1601 to 1603 famine. False Dmitry I, claiming to be Ivan's surviving son, seized power with Polish backing but was overthrown. Chaos ensued: civil war, Swedish and Polish occupations. National militias, led by Meinen and Pożarski, expelled Poles in 1612, paving the way for Mikhail Romanov's 1613 election, founding the dynasty. Early Romanovs stabilized Russia. Mikhail and Patriarch Filaret rebuilt, concluding wars with Sweden and Poland. Serfdom entrenched via 1649 Ulozhenie. Military modernization began, blending Western tactics. Peter the Great, 1682 to 1725, revolutionized Russia, dragging it westward. His grand embassy absorbed European knowledge, reforms forced Western dress, replaced the Boyar Duma with a Senate, and introduced merit-based ranks. The Great Northern War secured Baltic access, founding St. Petersburg, a window to the West built at immense cost. He subdued the church under state control, forging a military powerhouse amid brutality. Elizabeth Petrovna, 1741 to 1762, brought cultural flair via coup, founding academies and the Winter Palace. Her 7 years' war involvement elevated Russia, but her nephew Peter III's pro-Prussian tilt led to his overthrow. Catherine the Great, 1762 to 1796, a German princess, seized power via coup. An enlightened absolutist, she corresponded with Voltaire and convened a legislative commission, but reforms stalled. She expanded via Russo-Turkish wars, gaining Black Sea access, and partitioned Poland, erasing it from maps. Yet, serfdom deepened, fueling Pugachev's rebellion, 1773 to 1775. A massive peasant uprising suppressed brutally, hardening conservatism. Napoleon's 1812 invasion tested Russia. Scorched earth tactics and winter decimated his army. Victory elevated Russia. Alexander I shaped the Vienna Congress, gaining Poland. The 1825 Decembrist revolt, officers demanding constitution, failed, ushering Nicholas I's 1825 to 1855 reactionary rule. Orthodoxy, autocracy, nationality, Third Section police, Russification. Crimean War defeat exposed backwardness. Alexander II, 1855 to 1881, the liberator, emancipated serfs in 1861, introduced zemstvos, judicial reforms, and military modernization. But radicals assassinated him, halting progress. Alexander III, 1881 to 1894, reversed reforms, expanding Okhrana and Russification, sparking pogroms. As peacemaker, he fostered industrialization via Vita. Nicholas II, 1894 to 1917, clung to autocracy amid industrialization's woes. Rasputin's influence scandalized. The 1904 to 1905 Russo-Japanese War humiliated Russia, sparking Bloody Sunday and 1905 Revolution, forcing the October Manifesto and Duma. Post-1905, Stolypin suppressed radicals while reforming agriculture. But World War I, 1914 to 1918, devastated. Defeats, shortages, Rasputin's sway. Nicholas's command faltered. February 1917. Revolution. Women's strikes swelled. Garrison mutinied. Nicholas abdicated March 2nd, ending Romanovs. Provisional government promised liberties but continued war. Bolsheviks, via Lenin's April Theses, gained traction. Kornilov coup failed, arming radicals. October 25, 1917. Red Guards seized Petrograd bloodlessly, storming Winter Palace. Lenin decreed peace and land. Civil War, 1917 to 1922. Reds versus Whites, foreign interventions. Bolsheviks triumphed via Red Army, Red Terror. Romanovs executed 1918. USSR formed 1922. As echoes fade, the Russian Empire's saga, from Slavic mists to revolutionary fire, reminds us even giants yield to time, leaving lessons in ambition, resilience, and change. Yes, the fall of the Russian Empire in 1917 marked a dramatic pivot point, But the story does not end with the establishment of the Soviet Union. The echoes of the Tsarist era continued to reverberate, shaping the new state in ways both subtle and profound. The transition from empire to Soviet state was not a clean break, but a complex evolution, laden with inherited challenges, unresolved tensions, and a relentless drive to redefine Russia's place in the world. Let us delve deeper into the aftermath, exploring the Soviet consolidation, the lingering imperial legacy, and the new struggles that emerged as the Bolsheviks sought to forge a revolutionary society from the ashes of the old order. The formation of the USSR in December 1922 was a monumental achievement for the Bolsheviks, but it was built on the fractured remains of the Russian Empire. The new state retained much of the empire's vast territorial expanse, stretching from Eastern Europe to the Pacific, encompassing a dizzying array of ethnic groups, languages, and cultures. This multi-ethnic character, a hallmark of the Tsarist regime, posed an immediate challenge. The Bolsheviks, guided by Marxist ideology, promised equality among nations and the right to self-determination, yet the practical reality was a centralized state dominated by Russian-speaking elites. The early Soviet leadership, including Lenin, recognized the danger of nationalist backlash and initially supported the creation of Union republics. Ukraine, Belarus, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and others, each with a degree of nominal autonomy. However, this federal structure was more a strategic concession than a genuine devolution of power, as the Communist Party maintained ironclad control from Moscow. The imperial legacy also manifested in the Soviet approach to governance. The Tsarist autocracy had relied on a vast bureaucracy and a repressive apparatus, and the Bolsheviks adapted these tools to their own ends. The Cheka, which evolved into the NKVD and later the KGB, echoed the Okhrana's surveillance and terror tactics, albeit with a revolutionary veneer. The centralized planning that characterized Soviet economic policy, particularly under Stalin's 5-year plans, drew on the Tsarist tradition of state-driven development, such as the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway. Even the concept of a Third Rome, Moscow, as the spiritual and political successor to Constantinople, found a secular echo in the Soviet claim to lead the global proletariat, a kind of ideological imperialism that replaced the Tsarist divine mandate. Yet, the Soviet state also sought to erase the imperial past. The Romanov execution in 1918 was symbolic, but the broader campaign against bourgeois culture included the destruction of churches, the suppression of noble titles, and the rewriting of history to vilify the Tsarist era. Lenin and his successors aimed to create a new Soviet man, untainted by the feudal and autocratic traditions of old Russia. This radical break, however, was incomplete. The peasantry, still the majority of the population, retained deep cultural ties to pre-revolutionary life, and the vast rural landscape continued to resist the urban industrial focus of Bolshevik policy. The death of Lenin in 1924 ushered in a power struggle that culminated in Joseph Stalin's rise to dominance by the late 1920s. Stalin's rule, spanning from 1924 to 1953, marked a brutal intensification of Soviet power, drawing heavily on imperial precedents while pushing the revolution into new, terrifying territory. His policies of collectivization and industrialization were framed as a leap toward socialism, but they bore the hallmarks of czarist serfdom and autocratic control. The forced collectivization of agriculture in the late 1920s and early 1930s, which aimed to consolidate peasant land into state-controlled farms, mirrored the czarist land reforms intent to bind peasants to the soil, albeit with a communist twist. The result was catastrophic. The Holodomor, a man-made famine in Ukraine, 1932 to 1933, killed millions, echoing the famines that had plagued Tsarist Russia, but amplified by Stalin's ruthless quotas and grain requisitions. Stalin's Great Purge, 1936 to 1938, further reflected the imperial penchant for repression. The execution or imprisonment of millions, party members, military officers, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens, recalled the oprichnina of even the terrible terrible, where terror was wielded to consolidate power. The show trials, with their staged confessions, echoed the arbitrary justice of czarist times, but with a modern, propagandistic flair. Stalin's cult of personality, complete with grandiose titles and iconography, also harked back to the divine right czars, though he cast himself as the infallible leader of the proletariat rather than a God-anointed monarch. Territorially, Stalin expanded the Soviet Union in ways that resurrected imperial ambitions. The annexation of eastern Poland, the Baltic states, Bessarabia, and parts of Finland during and after World War II, 1939 to 1940, echoed Catherine the Great's partitions of Poland. The incorporation of these regions, often under the guise of liberation or protection, extended Soviet borders to their greatest historical extent, surpassing even the Tsarist peak. This expansionism, coupled with the imposition of Soviet control over Eastern Europe post-1945, positioned the USSR as a superpower, a role the Russian Empire had aspired to but never fully achieved. However, Stalin's territorial gains, while monumental, came at immense human and political costs and sowed the seeds for future instability. The annexation of eastern Poland, the Baltic states, Bessarabia, and parts of Finland through the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and subsequent wartime agreements was achieved through coercion, mass deportations, and suppression of local populations. These actions, justified as protecting Soviet interests or liberating oppressed peoples, mirrored Catherine the Great's expansionist rhetoric, but were executed with unprecedented ruthlessness, including forced collectivization and purges that decimated local elites and dissenters. By 1945, the Soviet sphere of influence extended across Eastern Europe, with puppet regimes installed in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and beyond, creating a buffer zone that fulfilled the Tsarist dream of regional dominance, but under the ideological banner of socialism. The post-war period saw the Soviet Union extend its influence over Eastern Europe, establishing satellite states that formed a new Soviet empire. This was not a formal empire like the Tsarist one, with governors and viceroys, but a sphere of influence maintained through military occupation, political control, and economic dependency. The Cold War that followed pitted this Soviet bloc against the Western Allies, led by the United States, in a global struggle that echoed the geopolitical rivalries of the 19th century, with Russia once again asserting its dominance over its near abroad. Despite its wartime triumphs, the Soviet system carried the seeds of its own decline. many of which traced back to the unresolved tensions of the Russian Empire. The centralized control that had enabled Stalin's industrialization and wartime mobilization became a liability in the post-war era. The suppression of ethnic diversity, a legacy of both Tsarist Russification and Soviet homogenization, bred resentment in the republics. The economic model, reliant on heavy industry and state planning, struggled to adapt to the technological and consumer-driven advances of the West, a problem exacerbated by the inefficiencies inherited from Tsarist agrarian stagnation. The death of Stalin in 1953 initiated a period of de-Stalinization under Nikita Khrushchev, who denounced the excesses of the purges and sought to liberalize the system. However, his reforms, like those of Alexander II, were limited and often reversed by his successors. The Brezhnev era, 1964 to 1982, saw a return to stagnation, with corruption and bureaucracy mirroring the late Tsarist decline. The invasion of Afghanistan, 1979 to 1989, a disastrous overreach reminiscent of Nicholas II's Far Eastern ambitions, drained resources and morale, further weakening the Soviet state. By the 1980s, under Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet Union faced a crisis of legitimacy. His policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, aimed to revive the system, but instead unleashed long-suppressed nationalist movements. The Baltic states, Ukraine, and other republics, chafing under decades of Russian dominance, demanded independence, echoing the centrifugal forces that had fragmented Kievan Rus and the Polish partitions. The attempted coup of 1991, led by hardline communists, failed, and by December of that year, the USSR dissolved, leaving Russia as its primary successor state. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked the end of the imperial narrative that had begun with the Slavic tribes and evolved through Tsarist and Soviet phases. The Russian Federation inherited the largest share of the Soviet territory, its nuclear arsenal, and its permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, but it also inherited the empire's challenges: a multi-ethnic population, economic disparities, and a yearning for great power status. The 1990s under Boris Yeltsin were a chaotic transition, with economic collapse and regional conflicts like Chechnya reflecting the difficulties of shedding imperial control. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked the end of the imperial narrative that had begun with the Slavic tribes and evolved through Tsarist and Soviet phases. The Russian Federation inherited the largest share of the Soviet territory, its nuclear arsenal, and its permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, but it also inherited the empire's challenges: a multi-ethnic population, economic disparities, and a yearning for great power status. The 1990s, under Boris Yeltsin, were a chaotic transition, with economic collapse and regional conflicts like Chechnya reflecting the difficulties of shedding imperial control. Vladimir Putin's rise to power in 1999 signaled a return to centralized authority, often framed as a restoration of Russian greatness. His annexation of Crimea in 2014 and support for separatists in eastern Ukraine revived imperial ambitions, drawing parallels to Catherine the Great's southern expansions. Yet, this neo-imperialism faces modern constraints: global economic interdependence, NATO's presence, and internal dissent. unlike the unchecked power of past czars. As we reflect on this journey, the Russian Empire's legacy is a mirror for the present, reminding us that empires, no matter how grand, are ultimately human constructs, subject to the same passions, errors, and aspirations that define us all. The narrative continues to evolve, but its roots lie deep in the soil of that ancient, sprawling land where history whispers still. From the Slavic tribes forging unity on the vast steppes to the Tsarist eagles soaring over empires, and from the Soviet hammer and sickle to the Russian Federation's tricolor, Russia's story is one of relentless ambition and enduring struggle. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 did not erase this legacy. It reshaped it. Today, the Russian Federation navigates a world far different from the courts of Peter or Catherine. Yet the echoes of empire linger in its quest for influence, its diverse peoples, and its unyielding spirit. As history whispers through the Kremlin's halls and the windswept plains, it reminds us that empires rise and fall, but their shadows stretch long, shaping the dreams and destinies of those who inherit their mantle. In Russia's vast tapestry, woven with triumphs and tragedies, the past is never silent. It speaks, challenges, and endures, urging us to ponder what the next chapter will hold.